Good morning to everyone. My name is Bruce Mountain. I'm the head of the Energy Policy Centre at Victoria University. Thank you all for coming. We'll have to do something about this noise adjacent. This is a very big moment for us. That makes a bit of a difference. It's a great pleasure to actually see you all here. This has been a very big moment for us putting together this report. Darren Edwards and Simon Bartlett have worked with me over a long period of time putting it together. We think we've come up with a plausible alternative plan to EMO's BNI West line, and we look forward to speaking to you about it for the next 50 minutes. This is also being live streamed, and there will be a Q&A session after about 45 minutes. We meet on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and up and coming. This is an online meeting as well as a webcast. It's an open meeting. The media is here. It is being live streamed and recorded. Let me start by setting up the order of the day. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk about why this report. I think it's necessary to introduce why we've gone to the effort of doing this. I'm going to set out a bit of the history to this transmission line. It's quite a contorted and difficult history, but it's important to understand the history and understanding the point that we've got to now. I'm then going to talk about the economics of interconnection, which is a critically important part of understanding VNI. Then I will actually hand over to Simon. Simon will spend the next 35 minutes talking about the hosting policy and what is the necessary amount of clean energy connection. He will set out the Plan B and the extended VNI West EMO alternative, and he will compare the two programs together. He will then turn back to me, and I will take the last 10 minutes talking about the price impacts of VNI West and our program, and I'll make a few comments on governance and what we recommend as changes to what ought to be done by the energy market operator, the Victorian government, and our national governments. We'll then turn over to Q&A, both live stream from our audience live stream and also from you. So, excuse me, Bruce, can you please, sorry, we're just going to get something sorted out on this noise. We hadn't anticipated there would be works going on. Okay, why this report? EMO says that by the end of 2023, Victoria will have 5,000 megawatts of wind and solar capacity, which will account for around 43% of the electricity demand on our grid, at least the grid demand as measured at the high voltage system. But roughly a third of the wind generation in the Western Victoria res will be curtailed, which means it'll not be able to get its production onto the grid. And in the Murray River, around a quarter of the solar generation. That's an average, or that's a figure for this year. The average over the coming decade peaks at around 30 to 40%. It reaches in some years even higher. So a very great amount of our renewable capacity is being curtailed. And that's because the transmission system is not able to take the production. So we've built the wind and solar, but it's sitting idle. Victoria set ambitious clean energy targets such that by 2035, 95% of the electricity in Victoria must come from clean sources, solar and wind, a small amount from hydro. That will require 15,000 megawatts of wind and solar, and roughly $20 billion will be needed. That investment will not arise unless the investors in that capacity are confident that they can access the grid. EMO has developed a plan of which the VNI West interconnection that starts on the northwestern border of Melbourne heads roughly west-northwest for 200 kilometers and then north for a further 200 kilometers. That's its principal response to the transmission requirement. In addition, it says a 1,500 megawatt in southwestern Victoria is really all that's needed to meet the renewable electricity targets and to transform the power system. In fact, that system will mean that Victoria will import roughly a quarter of the electricity that it uses, according to EMO's plans, by it's actually 2035. We disagree with EMO's plans. We think much more renewable hosting capacity is needed in Victoria to meet the Victorian government's targets. And in addition, EMO's plan imposes big costs on landholders and on others. Essentially, we believe we must do better. The plan that they've come up with is not going to achieve the necessary augmentation to allow the expansion of wind and solar. And in addition, it will impose very substantial costs on landholders because it cuts through so much new land. So we felt motivated by this, Darren, Simon and I, working independently for quite some time and coming together, finding a great deal of common ground. We felt motivated to properly critique this and to come up with an alternative plan, which is what we've done. This report is really many years really in the making. The consultation on this process has gone on for quite some time. It has obviously come to a head over the recent past, but there's a great deal of consultation and engagement with the authorities and others in building the study that we've built. I know this is a very wordy slide, but luckily there's a very big screen. Let me take you through some of the deeply troubled history of VNI West. It was first mentioned in the 2018 Integrated System Plan, which is a 5-yearly plan that the energy market is actually a 2-yearly plan that the energy market operator builds to map out the transition of our power system and the transmission augmentations that it thinks are needed. That was the first time VNI West was mentioned, but actually VNI West as an interconnector was first mentioned in a document which was first produced by EMO when it started life in 2010, which was a National Transmission Network Plan that it came up with, the very first document. And NEMLink, a 500 kV supergrid connecting Hobart to Townsville, was set out as a sketch in that document. And VNI West, although it wasn't known as such, was first mentioned there. A 500 kV supergrid, AC supergrid. That was the philosophy. And that's where we can trace the origin to. The Western Victoria Transmission Project, which was the first leg of VNI West from Melbourne to North Ballarat, was fleshed out in 2018 for the first time. The assessment of it finalized in 2019. And the rationale for the development of that, the first leg of VNI, was to expand Victoria's brown coal generation and increase exports from Victoria to displace more expensive black coal from New South Wales and Queensland until 2075. This was what EMO said in 2019. By then, we well understood the energy transition, and the first ISP was all about the transition, and exactly the opposite was put as the rationale for, for this line. The second leg of VNI West, which was from North Ballarat at that time up to the New South Wales border, was assessed in draft in July 2022. This time, unlike the 2019 document, all the Victorian brown coal was said to close soon, by then 2032. And even sooner if VNI West was not built. So building VNI West allowed you to relatively extend the life of coal. Most of the cost of the North Ballarat substation, a key part of the VNI West proposal, was actually excluded from the second leg on the basis that the first leg would be built, and it was excluded from the first leg on the basis that the second leg would be built. And so a large part of the cost of the total augmentation had been excluded. And VNI West, in the second assessment in mid last year, the claim for the benefit was that it was going to actually defer the construction of wind and solar, and relative to the counterfactual, increase Victorian brown coal generation output. And that was the origin of the benefits, at least until 2034. In February 2023, EMO did yet another assessment of this project. Now, the main benefit for VNI West for Victoria was avoiding pumped hydroelectrical storage that would otherwise need to be built in Victoria in the 2040s. And what VNI West was claimed to do then was allow you to import battery storage from New South Wales. That battery storage could be built just as cheaply in Vic. A great deal of consternation and opposition to that, as for the previous ones. Then in February 2023, new VNI West, this time from Melbourne to Wagga Wagga via a further point to the west, was set out. And at last, both points of VNI West, the two separate ones that I've spoken of, were brought together. The final VNI West was actually confirmed in June of this year, no longer stopping at North Ballarat, where a substation was, going out 200 kilometres to the west-northwest, and then 200 kilometres to the north to cross the border. EMO's proposals have been accompanied by two sets of orders from the Victorian government to expedite the implementation of it, and now being challenged in the courts. In 2018, EMO said the whole of VNI West would cost 2.7 billion, so that was the full 800-kilometre length, of which Victoria would be about half, so roughly 1.3 billion. We suggest the Victoria section alone will cost 4.9 billion. So I know it gets terribly detailed, isn't there? A great deal more that can be said about all of the calculations in it, but that's a bit of a potted history of VNI West and the regulatory assessments. Let me move on to interconnection economics. I think this is a critically important part of an understanding of VNI West. And specifically, is it much cheaper to make electricity in New South Wales than in Victoria, or vice versa? You can justify building a bridge in order to access resources on the other side of the bridge, and it makes sense economically if you can get access to a cheaper resource. And this underlies NEMLink, and the construction of the 500 kV supergrid is the idea that interconnection allows you to access cheaper electricity, regional interconnection. So using CSIRO produce cost estimates every year or so of the capital costs of wind and solar, which EMO use in their ISP, and EMO produce data on the capability of wind and solar in different parts of the country. Using their numbers, the cheapest wind farm in our border can produce electricity for 0.24 million per megawatt per year. In Victoria, by comparison, the most expensive wind farm produces electricity for 0.28 million per megawatt per year. So if we substituted New South Wales's best, cheapest wind electricity at 0.24 million for the most expensive at Victoria and 0.28, we get a saving of 0.047 million per megawatt per year. Okay, that's the sense of our saving. What does it cost us to access that saving? Well, we need to build an interconnector. What the VNI West interconnector will cost the Victoria section alone is 0.17 million per megawatt per year. That's the annualized cost of it over 50 years. So that generation cost saving, 0.047 over 0.17, is only 25% of the cost. Only a quarter of the cost of the transmission can be justified by the relative costs of accessing cheaper wind in New South Wales. I haven't done the sums Well, actually, I have done the sums for solar. I haven't done the sums in other areas for solar, which I'll come to. For solar, the relative cost per megawatt of solar is even cheaper than wind. And so doing the same calculation of the relative best solar resource in New South Wales versus the worst in Vic, you can only cover 12% of the cost. And we assume that the cheapest New South Wales is going to displace the most expensive in Victoria. Of course, that's not the way markets work. It'll be the cheapest in New South Wales is going to take the place of the next cheapest in Vic, or if we're exporting, going from Vic there. So this is a implausible upper limit of the possible saving available, and it doesn't come close to covering the cost of the interconnection. This is a critically important point intrinsic to VNI West, intrinsic to all the interconnection and the NEMLink proposal that EMO has set out. Cost saving from production is only one part of the economics of transmission. What about being able to access the wind resource at a time in one state when the wind's blowing and it's not blowing in the other? For this is a complex issue because accessing the diversity of supply actually hinges on many things, not just the wind availability, but the solar availability, the coincidence of the wind and solar and load, and most critically, the capability to store surpluses rather than to ship them. So it's a complex and not well understood area. A great deal of work needs to be done over a long period to get a grasp on it. But let me go to the fundamental question. What is the relative correlation of wind production in New South Wales versus Victoria? And what is the correlation of wind production in different parts of Victoria? Again, using EMO's number, the correlation of wind in the Western Victoria and Southwest, which are the two areas that have wind resources in New South Wales and Vic that are closest to each other, is 0.61. That's a high correlation. And we see the high correlation because geographically they're not terribly far from each other. So when wind systems come through, they're likely to affect the wind production. But the correlation of the wind resource from Western Victorian Gippsland is 0.51. It's still relatively high, but lower. So you get the diversity within the state, more so than you do in between the states. So the diversity there to be had is through augmenting your transmission capability within the states, not building it in between the states. So the case for transmission augmentation for diversity also does not stack up. These are fundamental economic criteria that underlie the whole plan and are important points that I wanted to get across just on VNI West as a focus. I'm now going to turn over to Simon for the next 30 minutes or so, and then I'll pick up at the end.
Yeah, welcome to this presentation. I've got about 33 slides to get through, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. Please, if you have a question, just note it down. We've allowed a lot of time for question time, but I'll do my best to keep to time. Now, this is our main objective is to provide enough hosting capacity to meet Victoria's needs to get 95% of its renewable energy in accordance with the Act. When I looked at the Act, I was quite surprised. The objects of the Acts are very much Victoria focused. Support developing renewables in Victoria. Encourage investment, employment, many skills, technology development in Victoria. Promote Victoria's transition to a clean economy. Contribute to the security of supply. Keep the lights on in Victoria. Yet, the way in which that's been expressed in mathematical terms, they use a percentage of the generation in Victoria, not the consumption. So you could easily satisfy that requirement by generating your renewables outside of Victoria and bringing it over these massive interconnections. In fact, AEMO's forecast within about 5 years or so, they have 80% of Victoria's energy coming across these massive interconnections into Victoria. Think about the objects of the Act. If we rely on imported electricity from other states, it won't meet the objects. You can't be sure where the electricity's come from. It could have come out of coal-fired stations for all you know. the renewable projects and initiatives, they won't be built in Victoria, they'll be built in other states. So how's that going to benefit Victoria? It won't promote Victoria's transition or contribute to security of supply, because I can tell you there are huge risks with long distance transmission, and I'll go into those in a moment. You can change all that if you just calculate the percentage as a percentage of the electricity consumed in Victoria. It gets over all of those, and in fact, that's what Queensland does. So we just need to follow the objects of the Act, but for this assessment, we've just taken the percentage as a percentage of the electricity consumed in Victoria, and it gets over all that confusion. Next. What do I do there?
You go on.
I'm there. Okay, so what is Victoria's consumption of electricity? This is straight out of the Integrated System Plan. It's their latest forecast of electricity consumption in Victoria. It's interesting when you compare where we've been tracking with where the forecast is going. It's been in decline now for quite a while, because people are using less electricity. There's more efficient usage of electricity. You've exported a lot of your manufacturing. So your need for electricity has been declining. You've always got to start with what is the forecast for your need. But the forecast for going out, it immediately flattens out, and then come about 2030, it ramps up. In fact, the growth in Victoria is just about, it ends up with Victoria growing twice as fast as New South Wales. It ends up with Queensland using more electricity than the whole of New South Wales. Like, these forecasts need a good long look at, but that's not the purpose of our task. We just took their forecasts and based Plan B on that very forecast. The table at the bottom is showing, well, what is the forecast electricity consumption in Victoria now, just before 2025, which is a key date, just before 2030, another key date, and by 2035, when we want 95% of our electricity to be coming from renewables in Victoria. What are the renewable targets? It's about 37%, we think, at the moment, by interpolation, 40%, 65, and 95. Take those percentages of consumption, you get those numbers at the bottom. So if you're wanting to have those percentages of electricity consumption from renewables, those are the amount of renewables Victoria needs to produce in Victoria using Victorian renewables, creating Victorian jobs. The right-hand one, just under 48,000. So how do I, okay, I know how to do it. Now, I've taken, AEMO's got their, if you look into the bowels of their project report for VNI West, these are the amounts of renewable energies they're saying will be produced in Victoria in those 4 years. Hydro, of course, it's up and down because they simulate droughts in the hydro. Fair bit of variability and risk if they don't get that right. But anyway, those are their figures. Wind that they forecast with the wind that they've scheduled to be installed in Victoria, quite a big growth over the next few years. But this is the energy that survives what we call the curtailment. You know, this is the stuff that's able to get onto the transmission grid. Large-scale PV, same story. Rooftop. Their forecast for rooftop is very optimistic. We've taken what we believe is more consistent with the government's policies. So what is the total renewables in Victoria? Those numbers. Last one, 42,000. Wow, that's way short of the 47,000, which Victoria needs for the 95%. So we're showing there the shortfall. So it's okay for the first 3 periods, but come 2035, short by a massive 5,000 gigawatt hours. Now, in terms of how much renewables do you need to make that up, I've taken half from wind, half from solar. We need about 22,000 megawatts extra renewables to be compliant. So how many megawatts does the ISP install? Those are the megawatts year by year. I've taken the current year, just before 2030, just before 35. Those are the 2 critical years for renewables. That's the amount of wind, large PV. That's the total amount of variable renewable energy, up to 12.7 gigawatts in 2034, 35, we currently got about 5,000, so that's roughly another 7,000 gigawatts. But because of the shortfall, we need another 2 gigawatts. So we need 2 more than the 7 that they're installing in order to be compliant with VRAT. Critical thing is, how has it increased from now to 2035? Well, it's gone up by 9,700 megawatts. So keep that figure in mind. There needs to be enough hosting capacity, enough transmission capacity to provide another 9,700 megawatts of renewables in Victoria. So we're now going to look at how does that line up with what's being provided. Now, when we developed Plan B, firstly we said we must meet VRAT. We must be able to get that extra capacity hosted, but we added some more objectives. Critically important, we must avoid blackouts. What's being proposed at the moment has what are called single points of failure. One fault on that 500 kV tower, one tower comes down, it will black out, it will take out both circuits on that line. I can tell you that will cause a cascading power supply problem and black out southern Victoria, Melbourne and the smelter. So we don't want that. It's defined as a system of national significance, a bit of legal jargon. But we don't want to have that happening to Victoria. We've got to slash this wastage of renewables. Like we've so hard to bring renewables, so expensive. We can't keep wasting 40, 50% in spills and another 10% in transmission losses. So we said, well, we want that 40% too high. It's got to come down. I targeted 13% for the Murray River and Western Victoria. Marginal loss factors, those are very important to the owners of these renewable energies. They're as low as 0.8 up in southwestern New South Wales. They're about 0.87 up in the Murray River. They've got to come up. They've got to come up 0.93, halve the losses, if you like, from Victoria's remote renewables to Melbourne. We want to minimise the amount of new land. The taking of new land is what is causing all of the concern and adverse impacts on the farmers, on the Indigenous people. You know, that's where you're going to find things of importance to the Aboriginal people if you start taking new land, especially where they're taking it near the Murray River. So we want to minimise the amount of land we've got to take. How do you do that? Just build your lines, make use of your existing transmission easements, rebuild on existing easements. If there's spare easements, use those. That can be done to meet Victoria's needs without taking new easements, nearly for all of the plan. We want to minimise public opposition. It's been a material source of delay, but it's now starting to splinter the Victorian society. We're having a city versus country division. That is not good. It's got to be stopped. We don't want that, not in Australia. And we want to diversify. You can't predict exactly where these wind farms and solar farms are going to be precisely, not over 25 years. Oh, come on now. So we want to have a flexibility. Where they do develop, we've got a reasonable chance of connecting them into the network, getting that power efficiently onto the grid and down to Melbourne. So how do we do this? What's the strategy for Plan B? Well, critical is there's a lot of very weak overloaded 220 kV network. It is just about to collapse. You wouldn't believe how close it is in the northwest and centre of Victoria. That's got to be rebuilt. It's only got a rating of 400 megawatts each line, and there's only 2 winding their way down from northwest down to Ballarat. So what we proposed is replace them in situ on the existing easements, but do it with really substantial transmission. Instead of 400 megawatts, put up twin circuits on the towers, each circuit capable of carrying 957 megawatts. Now that's close on 1,800, 1,900 megawatts instead of 400. So that is a massive change. Needed to keep the losses down, but also to bring in more renewables, help the existing renewables, but bring in more. What we'll do is we'll build alongside the existing line. For safety reasons, you've got to keep about 10 metres away at the tower bases. So you build them side by side, the existing towers, leave the existing line switched on, delivering all the services. shift the easement sideways, take an extra 10, 15 metres on one side, give the landowner back what you don't need at the end. This talk of demolishing houses, I don't know where that comes from. I don't think, I couldn't find a house within 15 metres of an existing transmission line. So I don't know where AEMO has got that from. Rehabilitate the unused part of the easement, hand it back to the landowner. If that's a problem, we can always build exactly in the centre line using temporary structures. Prefer not to, it's more efficient to do it this way. This has been done in Queensland many times. There's no need then for Western Renewable Link or VNI West or their 80-metre high towers or their new easements. The towers we're talking about building are 38 metres high on average. That's half the height. And height, you can see a tower from much further away. If it's 80 metres high, it's roughly the square of the height. So 4 times less visible. And building them where the existing line is, well, the society has got used to those existing lines. A much stronger, resilient 220 kV network. You'll see it's not just one set of towers supporting both lines, it's 4 sets of towers on different routes. That's the way Victoria did things when the SECV was in control. There are 2 new 500 kV lines in Plan B, but don't use double circuit towers. Build the same sort of kit you see around Melbourne, those more squatter single circuit 500 kV lines side by side. Costs a bit more. Visually, much more pleasant to look at, I can say. But from security, the chance of taking out both towers at the same time, it's almost non-existent. Whereas you have a single tower, you're going to take it down. Here's a map of Plan B. In green is what we call phase 1. Phase 1 is get stuck into this for the next 4 years, and I'll go into what they are in a moment. In blue is get stuck into that in phase 2, the next 4 years, which is the period when they will be building VNI West. The green is when they're building WRL. The red is the 4 years after that, leading up to the 2035 deadline. Now, phase 1, we're proposing some immediate measures to alleviate the pain and wastage of existing renewables. The left diagram shows the Project Energy Connect project, which is now under construction to link South Australia with New South Wales. They're proposing a massive rebuild of the link between Project Energy Connect and the top end of the Victorian grid. It's from Baronga to Redcliffe. They're talking about quadrupling the capacity of that 220 kV line. So top marks, they've taken that bit on board. But the trouble is the power that's coming from South Australia or New South Wales, the power that comes from all of those PV up in southwest New South Wales, electricity flows like water. It wants to get to the load centre. It wants to get down to Melbourne. It'll pour over that stronger interconnection straight into Redcliffe. What does it find there? A weak, low capacity network already overloaded, but that won't stop it. It will try to get on that network. And you will have a major problem. That network's already too weak. So our proposal is just open the circuit breaker, switch it off in the daytime, especially the daytime when the sun's running hard and that power's coming out of the New South Wales solar plants. You can't afford to let it come in. It probably shouldn't have been built, but switch it off is the first thing in the daytime. Got to do that before Project Energy Connect is even energised, which is meant to happen December next year. The second thing is that little diagram there shows a conductor, which is the wires on the power lines. Victoria is really fortunate. You used old British designs and standards. The centre of the bundle is steel, so it's much stronger. Those conductors, they've been designed. So this next diagram is showing the sag of a span of transmission line. You've got to keep it above the red line because that's the safety clearance. You've got to keep about 5.8 metres clearance between the conductor and the ground for electrical safety. But those lines that you have, they, of all conductors, they've got the lowest, it's called the coefficient of thermal expansion. You can overload those. They'll sag a bit more. I've calculated that if you increase the loading by 20%, their temperature would run from 75 degrees to 90 degrees. They'll sag another ½ metre. But how do you know there's not a ½ metre spare out there already? So we're saying some work needs to be done. Just go out and measure the clearances. Try what it's like if you increase the loading. If there is a problem, you can always replace the insulators on the lowest bundle of wires and hitch it up. So that's one proposal. We think that could get an extra 20% out of those existing lines, which is worth having in the short term. Well, the right-hand diagram is showing that the comparable ratings. Also install more weather monitors to continuously measure wind speed and temperature. Tasmania is an expert on this, been doing it for 40 years. So when the wind's blowing, that has a huge effect on cooling the conductor. If the sun's not out blaring on the conductor, that has a huge effect. Transgrid and Victoria have traditionally just assumed the same sort of weather all the time, but it's not like that. So if you can measure those conditions automatically, do your calculations, you can get more out of the line. Replacing the lines on existing easements, that diagram there shows the, if you had two 220 kV lines, you need to keep about 6 to 8 metres separation between the wires on both lines for electrical safety. 8 metres is comfortable. So you can build alongside 8 metres away at the top, let the other line keep running, and then pull it down at the end. The height of these towers is only 38 metres on average. The 500 kV is about 80 metres. That is a huge difference, I can tell you, when you look at these things. I've spoken about the rest of that. Cost estimates, we based our cost estimates. AEMO has just released a very comprehensive report on how to estimate the cost of lines. So we picked that up, used that, made a few adjustments. I said, well, we don't need to get a new easement, so take out all the easement costs, which are quite large in their estimate. We won't have a problem with natural vegetation on the easement because we're more or less sticking to the existing easement, so take that out. And allow for the fact that we're going to put a bigger conductor up there. So that's what we did. So basically, did all of that for all of these projects. And for Plan B, won't go into detail, it's all there, but the total cost was about 4.9 billion. And then we've added interest during construction, which is something which doesn't seem to have been included in AEMO's analysis, but someone's got to finance these things during construction. So we've added that onto the cost. Hosting capacity. How, we said we need to be able to provide enough transmission for 9,700 megawatts. I think we need more. I think we need a bit more to allow a bit of more room for the existing renewables so they stop this spillage. But we've looked at the hosting capacity. I noticed AEMO has a question on this, but we've just used conventional engineering practice. N-1, I call it. So where there's a power line, allow for one of those lines to be out of service. What is the rating of the remaining line or lines? Add that up. And we haven't double counted. Some of these lines will pick up power from the Murray River, also pick up power from Western Victoria. So we've allowed for the fact we haven't double counted. Based on that, we get these numbers. To achieve these numbers, there may be a bit of a voltage problem, which is a technical issue, but that can easily be addressed over time by installing capacitor banks, as Queensland has done. But it adds up to 11,485 megawatts. Wow, that's way higher. Now, that's 1,700 megawatts higher than the 9,700 we need. As I said, the additional will help to reduce spills. It'll provide a bit of flexibility. What about the VNOS plan? This is a diagram out of the Victorian Planning Report. You would not believe, I couldn't believe the problems that that grid has at the moment. Those are the numbers of hours across various points just on the 220 kV network running from northwest Victoria down to Ballarat and Melbourne. They add up to 3,858 hours of the year. That's 44% of the year. Last year, those grids were constrained. No wonder you're spilling so much renewables. That is disgusting. That is disgraceful. It should have been reinforced years ago. That's what's got to be done. This is the sort of spills that it's causing. Get rid of that. No. Previous. Come on. Sorry. These are the spills straight out of AEMO's studies. For Murray River, V2, for Western Victoria, V3. At the moment, or for the next 7 years, they're averaging 36%, 25% for Western Victoria solar and wind. So we're getting spills way too high. They come down a bit in the next 10 years, but they're still too high. They then get back to their former levels because the 500 grid is getting more and more loaded up. It's not just loaded up bringing the renewables to Melbourne, it's also trying to bring these exports into Melbourne if that happens. So you've got, the spills are too high. This is AEMO sent this diagram to me yesterday. It's a record, it's their latest queue. So the different colours are the status of inquiries to connect new renewables to Victoria. Blue are existing, yellow are inquiry, orange application, pink is actually being commissioned. But when you look at that, you think, well, gee, there's a lot of activity up around Redcliffs. There's a lot of activity around Bendigo. There's a lot of activity out near Horsham. There's a lot of activity down around Ballarat, east and west. And then you think, well, hold it, what are they doing here? They're going to build a new substation only up near Kerrang. They're going to build a new substation down at Wahroonga. The green circles, those are the areas which will be serviced by those new substations. If you want to service people in the red circles, you need to build more 220 kV network, substantial 220 kV network. In fact, we determined you need to build about 550 kilometres of 220 kV network up around Kerrang, east and west. You need to build about 300 east and west down near Wahroonga, not Wahroonga, forgotten the name. But VNI West is not enough. For it to work and deliver those renewable hosting capacities, you need to do a massive build of 220 kV network in any case. And in fact, it's got to be done before those 500 kV substations are energised. There's no doubt about it. It's been omitted. AEMO have only looked at the main grid plan. They haven't looked at what I call deep connection issues. So in developing our adjusted plan for VNI West, we allowed for building those 220 kV networks. At the moment, if you look at the applications for new renewables, there's over 1,000 megawatts around Redcliffs. There's no way they can get to New Kerrang. The existing lines are too congested. There's 638 megawatts near Bendigo. That's been bypassed. That will need a massive build to get to Kerrang. There's 500 megawatts near Horsham, but the line to Bulgana already congested. There's 340 megawatts at Warborough. That line's congested. There's 770 megawatts up near Elan, just near North Ballarat, but North Ballarat is now bypassed. So it's not going to work. You are not going to be able to service these needs for new renewables to install their capacity in Victoria without a massive build of 220 kV network on top of VNI West. We found 3 other areas where we believed we had to extend the VNI West plan. Gippsland they've assumed that there's going to be 2,000 megawatts of new wind farms in Gippsland by 2029. It's only 6 years away. The grid will have to be extended from the Latrobe Valley, the best grid in the Southern Hemisphere, about 65 kilometres down to the coast where the better renewables are, or maybe that's where the offshore wind comes ashore, but they haven't included that in the assessment. Project 1.5, Southwest Victorian Res. They've admitted already that they need another 500 kV line to provide 1,500 megawatts of hosting. The ISP's preferred option is run another line from Sydenham to Mirrabul across to Mortlake. And it could actually carry about 3,000 megawatts more. So we've allowed for that. And lastly, up near Central North Victoria, they've got another 400 megawatts of solar farms coming on there. The cheapest way to do that would be run a line on the existing easement from Shepparton to Dedarang through Glenrowan. So those three projects we've allowed for on top of the, so this is the total list of the projects. So we've basically got the WRL project, which they're saying will be finished by mid-27. We're going to need another line down in Gippsland to manage their 2,000 megawatts of wind. By the earliest, I think, is mid-29 is what AusNet is saying they could do that. By no, AEMO said they need it by mid-29. AusNet could do it by late 2027. The earlier, the better. There is the line around Shepparton. AEMO have programmed that for 2030. There's VNI West itself, mid-31. There's the Sydenham to Mirrabul, mid-33, they've told us. Plus, we've got the two builds of the 220 kV line. So we included all those projects in extended VNI West. So there's a map there of that. So it's just repeating what I've said. What's the cost of those works? So again, we used AEMO's own estimates, nothing under the table. And based on their estimates, that ended up being about 1,600 kilometres of new line, cost of nearly 9 billion without interest during construction, with interest during construction, about $11 billion. So that's double the cost of Plan B, you might recall. It was 6 billion with interest during construction. So it looks like the extended plan is probably double the cost. What hosting capacity will it provide? Used exactly the same approach to assessing hosting capacity. It added up to 9,640. Well, that's pretty close to 9,700. I'll give that a tick. But to get that, you need those additional lines. Right? So it just squeaks over the VREP, but it needs the additional lines. How do these two compare? We've looked at them from a number of different perspectives. This is our sort of master sheet for comparing the length of new lines. Extended VNS is actually longer, more lines. You're building more lines. What about easements? It's nearly all on new territory, all greenfields. Whereas Plan B, it's mostly on existing easements. Yeah, there's a lot of widening, the 10 metres or 15 metres, but I think that would be much less of a problem to widen the existing right-of-ways. The area, big difference, 700 hectares against 169. We developed a criteria, I'll explain that, for assessing all of the impacts. And whether we looked at cost, whether we looked at socio-economic and environment, whether we looked at visual, whether we looked at culture and heritage, the extended plan, much worse than Plan B. And I'll come to that in a moment, how we did that. Costs, almost double. Hosting capacity, this is including the existing capacity. Curtailment, 20 to 40% versus 13, etc. Now, under the NEVA Order 102, issued in 2023 February, you must consider economic, environmental, cultural heritage, land use, and technical impacts of these alternatives. So we looked at, AEMO did that. We looked at what they did, but they assigned 70% of the weighting to economic impacts. Like, if you assign 70% of the weighting to economic impacts, the other impacts are just about trivial. It doesn't matter what they score, they're going to be overwhelmed by the economic measure. Then we looked at how they applied it. And I was gobsmacked to see they applied the economic indicator in reverse order. With these techniques, the lower the score, the better. But they've used the net benefits out of the regulatory test as their economic criteria, where the highest score is better. The more benefits you deliver, the better it looks from an economic perspective. But they've used that in their multi-criteria assessment. Not only is it overwhelming the others, but it is in the reverse order. They had almost the same net benefits for their option as the other one they looked at, so it didn't matter too much. But if it had been done looking at a comparison with Plan B, it would have been hopeless. So we developed our own MCA, very proud of that. The way we assess them, consumer impact, we said, well, that's based to the cost. The more you spend, the more it's going to affect consumers. Their prices will go up, the more it will affect Victoria's economy. Socioeconomic, the more land you take, the more of an impact it's going to have on farmers, the more of an impact it's going to have on Indigenous culture and heritage, and the environment. So we use basically what's the area of land you're going to take. Visual impact, that is crucial. I can tell you from years of experience that it's the visual impacts that are frightening and scaring people about transmission of any sort. And building towers 80 metres high, building towers with 24 wires instead of 12, building towers on greenfield sites instead of on existing right-of-ways or alongside towers of similar design has a huge effect on the visual impacts. So that we use those measures, tower height, whether it's on a new easement, the length of the line, the number of wires, to determine a visual impact measure. Cultural and heritage, I've done a lot of work dealing with local Indigenous tribes and elders, and I can tell you, you need them to be involved. You need them to tell you the cultural stories. They know much better. And there's really two aspects of cultural and heritage. There's what I call above ground, relics, scar trees, and that really depends on how much extra land you take, because there's very unlikely to be those things on existing easements. So we used the extra area of land as a measure of the above ground. Below ground, they're concerned about digging a hole and coming across a burial site. And I suppose that's the same, whether you're doing it on an existing easement, then doing it on a new easement. But we used how many holes are you going to bore? That's related to the length of the line. So we used that. We weighted them 50-50 apiece. The first three, we gave 30% weightings. We didn't apply the 70%. So 30, 30, 30, 10 is what we used. But I think this is a really better, much better way to assess this multi-criteria assessment. How did it come out? Well, Plan B is on the left, Extended VNI West is on the right. And of no surprise, every one of those parameters scored much lower with Plan B than Extended VNI West. We went project by project for Extended VNI West, and no surprise, VNI West is the highest scorer. Building that new 220 kV network in V2 is also of a higher network. It's all green fields, requiring new easements. There's 550 kilometres of it, so it scores pretty high too. So lowest being Shepherd and Tededering, because they too are building an existing easement. Plan B, much lower scores, highest being Gippsland, to extending the 275, the 500 kV network from the Trove Valley out into Gippsland. It's only 65 kilometres, but you are taking more land, and we assume two twin 500 kV lower towers because that's much more secure, costs a bit more, but that has a lower visual impact than 80 metre high towers. But even with that, that's how it's scored. Now, I've been accused by AEMO already of being reckless in saying that there is a pretty real risk that this new line they're proposing is going to come down. And when it comes down, for various reasons, it'll take out both circuits. And when that happens, I can tell you, it will cause a cascading power system collapse across Victoria. It will end up with southern Victoria, which means Melbourne, it means the smelter, everything across that sort of southern edge with the existing 500, it will just get blacked out. It will lose the power from the new 500, it'll overload, the interconnectors that come into Victoria at the moment will also overload and trip. The whole thing will go black. There is no doubt of that in my mind, and I've got 50 years of experience in this game, so I know what I'm talking about. And the sort of causes, you can have severe lightning. When severe lightning hits one of these double circuit towers, it energizes the top of the tower, it flashes back onto both circuits. They both must be tripped. So they'll both go out if you get hit by severe lightning. That happens quite a number of times, many times every year in the net. Severe bushfires. Wildfires create a flame and gas, which can trip out both circuits. Flood damage. New Zealand's just had that damage created by extreme floods. Sabotage. Perth has just had someone remove the bolts from the bottom of one of these big towers, collapsed on the ground. I'm not being reckless in saying that can happen. It does happen, and I am not allowed to, but I can talk about many cases where this has happened elsewhere in the NEM, including in Queensland. Destructive winds. We know that Victoria has lost something like 60 towers have collapsed in the last 50 years from destructive winds. And they've recently brought down the 500 kV out at Cressy. The statistics don't lie. The Victorian statistics show you get one of these major events every 4 years, and that's pretty frequent. So this will happen. And if it does, when it does, it's going to black out southern Victoria. But I'm reckless. I think it's reckless to pretend otherwise. Yeah, that's what I talk about, southern Victoria. And AEMO has admitted it themselves. There's a quote there, you can look it up, but they basically said back in July last year that with the WRL, if they do lose both circuits, it's going to cause a cascading collapse of the transmission network. Take that a bit further, that's going to spread across the whole of southern Victoria. So they've already identified this themselves. The SEV never took these risks. When they developed the 500 kV network, they knew they had to build single circuit lines, even on separate easements. It's okay to build double circuit lines at 220, but you're better to do it with a number of double circuit 2 lines to provide more redundancy and resilience. And that's exactly what Plan B does. I'll skip over these, but they're basically showing what is the transmission capacity. N-1, meaning one of the circuits is out, N-2, meaning 2 of the circuits out for Plan B. And you'll notice there's still 1900 megawatts capacity from the northwest. There's still 4000 megawatts capacity coming out of those 2 regions. Then shows you what happens with extended V&I. The numbers with an N-2, less than half. So Plan B has a lot more resilience and redundancy in the network than the extended plan. So just in summary, did we meet the 6 objectives? And I believe we did. We will support VREC to achieve the 95% renewables by 2035. We will avoid major blackouts. We won't have any single points of failure on new transmission line defined as being critical infrastructure. In fact, we don't have any 500 kV double circuit whatsoever. It'll slash the wastage of existing renewables at Murray River and Western Victoria. It'll cut the spills, I've done the calculations, to about 13% at worst. It'll increase the marginal loss factors up to about 0.93, which is really important to those. They are losing money hand over fist at the moment in those areas. It minimises the amount of land, big time, required for new transmission because it uses existing easements. It minimises public opposition because there will not be that groundswell across rural Victoria complaining about the amount of land we are taking with the plan. And it will diversify where the renewables can be located. It's got a bit of additional capacity there, so it will allow for uncertainty on where these sites are developed. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Simon. A very great amount of information to take in. I'm going to take you through a few final slides, and then we look forward to hearing your questions and also taking account of questions from the floor. Briefly, the electricity price effects. VNI West plus the necessary augmentation, we estimate will put up transmission charges by 124%. They'll go from 650 million to 801 million per year. This is a 124% increase on top of the existing 640. EMO says the increase will be 25%. So there's a 100% difference between them and us. The difference for the gap is they use 2021 costs. They don't include the interest during construction. They discount their capital at 5%, whereas in the ISP, they say the number is 7%. They use lower capital numbers and much lower OPEX numbers, and they exclude the consequential elements of the augmentation. So there's quite a big gap between us. I think we're confident that we think the difference is real and large. Plan B will also put up charges, but by about $1 billion less per year, roughly $1 billion less per year than extended VNI West. The difference in that is Plan B is of itself cheaper, so the transmission element is cheaper. And then coming back to where we started, the curtailment of the renewables, to attract the investment when the renewables is actually curtailed, you need to compensate for that loss of production. If you don't, they will not be attracted. They will say, well, why should we invest if the expectation is we lose a quarter or a third of our energy production and we don't get paid? And we valued that additional payment as adding $425 million to electricity bills or to taxpayers that comes on top of the additional transmission charge. And so 940 million more as the aggregate difference between VNI West and us. So rounding it all out, evidently there's a big difference twixt us and them. There's obviously a number of substantive issues. This has got a long way to go to be resolved, but we think there's enough reason to be concerned, and there's enough rationale to justify recommendations that are really quite substantive. First of all, for the Government of Victoria to appoint VicGrid as its statutory planning authority immediately. VicGrid's been established as a department or as a sub-element of a department. There's legislation in passage to establish it as a separate entity, answerable to the Parliament and to the Minister. That should take place as a matter of urgency, and planning authority be transferred from EMO to VicGrid. In addition, we're asking VicGrid to independently advise on the merits of Plan B versus the VNI West program. So we've set out our claim, we've set out the rationale. We're seeking an independent view from VicGrid publicly to the public to say, here is VicGrid's views on the relative difference between them. We're concerned that all of this review might end up in stasis when we have an urgent transition to get on with, demanded by the community, by electricity consumers and others. In parallel with these institutional changes, we recommend VicGrid be asked to advise on the implementation of our elements of our plan, some of which entail capital, others of which are not capital, about using the lines heavier and so on. That should happen in parallel and with urgency. We also make recommendations for the Australian government, and we seek the Federal Treasurer and Energy Minister to ask the Productivity Commission to establish guidelines for the Rewiring the Nation Corporation funds, $20 billion of federal money that the Clean Energy Finance Corporation is able to actually disperse, mainly or almost exclusively, I think, as loans. We're seeking the Productivity Commission to advise guidelines on how that money is dispersed. At the moment, EMO's ISP and their interconnection plan will drive that. We don't think that plan stacks up. And so we're seeking the Productivity Commission to set guidelines on that. And finally, the Ministerial Council, which constitutes jurisdictional as well as federal members, we're seeking an independent inquiry into the regulatory investment test, the actionable ISP, which is EMOs turning their transmission plans into law, into rules, and the approval of spending under that to be reviewed independently. And that review to take place from people who are not ex-employees of the industry or of governments, a proper independent review, perhaps behind closed doors, perhaps in the public, but an independent review on that. At that point, I think I'm going to conclude and thank you for patiently listening to the great amount of detail that you've had to take in. And we look forward to discussion from you, questions and answers. Thank you. First of all, question just very briefly, where can we find the Plan B report? On the Victoria Energy Policy's website, vpc.org.au. Peter Farley.
Congratulations on fantastic effort, but where's storage towards? I mean, solar plants in the northwest have about 25% capacity factor unconstrained. So that if you had enough storage at the plant, you could quadruple the amount of energy you could send down. Exactly. Theory. And the other side of it is putting the storage low. When there's lots of times where we're generating more energy than we can use, even without transmission constraints. So that could be in all the zone substations and the terminal stations, whatever.
So we didn't address storage. We sort of thought we'd done enough, but I had a good look at storage. Compared to Victoria's energy storage plant, the extended plant is just like it doesn't install any unit pump storage. In Victoria, it installs only a few hundred megawatts of batteries. They're supposed to install 2.6 gigawatts by 2035. I had a look. My career goes back to, I designed and built a lot of pump storage schemes in Australia and overseas earlier in the career. And I'm believing, yes, the storage is much better up where the renewables energy are located. That way you don't have to transmit the surplus energy. It's stored there and you can use the grid capacity to get it down to the loads. So I think you're right, it should be there. The way costs of batteries are coming down, they're already economic compared to Stone 2. They're economic compared to city schemes that Queensland is building. We should be looking at large volume batteries located at the local centre. You only need 2 or 3 years. You don't have these huge long lead times. You don't have the huge construction risks that have with Stone 2. You don't need this highly skilled workforce. It's the obvious technology. It's on our doorsteps. That's where we should be going, I believe. The other thing, when we flew down yesterday from Brisbane, do you realise the whole of the way across New South Wales and Victoria, dense cloud, this happens, and when we landed, no wind. It happens especially in winter. It's going to be even worse in El Nino years. The whole of Victoria and New South Wales can be covered with clouds that the sun can't penetrate to get to the PV. And there will be still wind conditions. There's a research paper being written by the University of New South Wales just recently. They've gone back to the last 120 years statistics, and they've mapped the reses on it. And they're saying there is almost certain likelihood that in winter time, this is going to occur to every res in Victoria and New South Wales. So you think, wow, no solar, no wind. How's energy storage going to help if it goes on for months at a time? Queensland, very different weather patterns. The Pilbara, the same. You can't build a transmission that far. And the amount of power you're going to need is colossal. Transmission is not the solution. you're going to have to find something else. AEMO studies burn an awful lot of gas, and that is exactly why. So I think the public needs to rethink the importance of retaining some gas to get them through these periods. I didn't want to be pushing that. I'm talking about transmission. That's an answer to your question.
But perhaps I'll just add very briefly, Alan, just prior to taking your question. Storage can improve the capability of the utilization of the transmission line and make it more efficient. But there needs to be a transmission line in order to do that. So it's a joint product and they need to happen together. There is, and you know I'm very bullish on storage. There are other aspects, the regulatory and economic treatment of storage as between the electricity market, the energy market, and the transmission market is complex. And it's going to take a long time to figure out how you distribute the money flows between them. So yes, storage is going to grow enormously. Yes, storage is going to greatly improve the productivity of transmission and mean we can utilize our wind and solar better. But at this point, we can't say leave our existing networks fine and just build batteries and we're done. Alan.
Well, actually, you almost answered my question. Your question would be my question. I think it's incredibly important. I agree with everything you said. It really answers the question in terms of, say, the economic impact. If you did pursue over these 10 years the extraordinary reduction in cost of batteries, increase in availability, of course, you're still going to need transmission lines. That's important to know good utilization of those lines. What would it do to the cost analysis? In other words, is there a plan C you're going to come out with next year, perhaps, that includes the role of batteries?
AEMO's ISP has looked at, they forecast the declining price of batteries for 1 hour, 2 hour, 4 hour, and 8 hour storage. They forecast the price of pump storage for 8 hour. At the 8 hour mark, the 8 hour batteries are about half the price of pump storage. Nearly all of the pump storage forecast in the ISP is 8 hour storage. And I've asked them, isn't that batteries? Because it's been retired 20 years after its commission. They said, yeah, of course it is. It's not pump storage. They have what's called deep pump storage. That's pump storage, but I'm wondering if they didn't have a 24-hour battery. I've tried working out the cost. It's a bit dearer than pump storage for 24 hours at this stage. But I think batteries are competitive. And we're going to need storage. We're definitely right. We're going to need storage. We need, I think, close to the generation source. Probably need some down to the load centre. Gippsland, for example, would be perfect. It's connected almost directly to the load centre with a very solid grid, and there's plenty of land out there.
But Alan, to your point generally, we are going through a technology revolution, as you know. We don't want Plan B, like VNI West, to form the status of a done and dusted, just implement. It needs to evolve. And there will be greater scope for storage. We wanted to focus on transmission augmentations capable of getting the entry now. It may well be that with greater storage, some of those can be pulled back a bit, but the cost impacts are not huge in a relative sense. So we don't imagine there's a fundamental restructuring to be had. The storage will allow the transmission system that is redeveloped to last much longer and build and meet much greater future demand. David.
Is there any level of repaying those curtailment charges that you put up?
Yes. No, in that the wind and solar developers that have arrived are being curtailed. Many of them have offtake contracts which insulate them from price, but not volume. So they're wearing that volume. And when we observe in the market, very few new wind and solar plants reaching financial close, we surmise a large part of that is investors looking at having burned their figures quite badly and saying, why should we invest if we're facing substantive risk on the volume? And seeing EMO's own projections of the energy curtailment, when the lenders and the equity providers get the due diligence done, they'll say, well, I don't care what you engineer think. This is what EMO says, and this is the transmission system that's being built for it. Why would we invest without a substantial subsidy to make up the gap?
So all of those plan lines you show that we have new generation. None of those reach financial flows.
No, no.
I think when you look at the statistics, Victoria is getting the fall in the development and in turn in renewables ahead of the other states. Queensland is still getting people rocking up, wanting to build solar, wanting to build wind. In fact, they've committed to it. But that stopped about 2 years ago in Victoria. I think because of the existing spillage. I believe the AEMC is working on a framework for compensating renewables from their spillages paid for by mums and dads, electricity customers. There's one means of overcoming that. That's going to add further to the cost of electricity. It's not really addressing at the root cause, the spills.
Yeah. Nick.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Bruce. Just wondering from a timeline perspective and a risk perspective as a project, if you looked at it in the detail of your report, when I think about the numbers of new easements, 1270 kilometres BNI West versus 130 kilometres Plan B, I mean, that's an order of magnitude. And when I hear you, Simon, talking about SAG and towers and developing new easements with what's going on in Bush. I'm from up in the northwest. Our share fund is up in arms and it's got banners already and in the local papers. There's no social license. So have you looked at the risk which then plays out into both timing for the two plants and plays subsequently out in cost?
So I'll just give an overview and then, yes, and the origin of the 220 kV rebuild existing easements is around timing and social license and land access. That's the heart of it, Simon.
I've had a lot of experience getting routes to new transmission lines in Queensland. I was chief operating officer. We built 2,000 to 3,000 kilometres transmission line, and I know the impact of taking new right-of-ways, certain greenfield right-of-ways, has on the farmers, the impact on communities, and I've experienced how they can stop dead-end tracks. Like Eastland resulted in, we were working with Transgrid, we were using their technique where they were putting new lines everywhere. It got the whole of the rural community offside. It resulted in the sacking of the DOS Labor government. That is not the way to go. But if you build on an existing easement, hardly anything is complained about it, especially if you build towers that are similar in height to the existing towers. If you have to take an extra 10, 15 metres and give the land back, unless that's had some significant impact on the farmers' operations, but they won't be anything like as vocal as what they are at the moment. We could even give them access to the steel and the conductor that comes down to use themselves. And that's, the industry and farmers are very enterprising, innovative people, and the scrap metal is worth a lot of money. So I think that we're almost definitely much closer to getting social license. There's a lot of damage to be smoothed over in the credibility of the power industry in Victoria. But I believe that Plan B is almost certain to get there much quicker. I think it will avoid, we've got 3 Supreme Court cases, and we've got a community who's just locking the gates, won't serve the people from the industry when they come out to the shops. It's no doubt there's going to be huge delays with the existing plan, but I believe Plan B is much more likely to get it there.
Can I take 2 questions from the website? First of all, our report call will be online shortly. Secondly, there's a question, what does Plan B or extended VNI West mean for private transmission? Well, that's a matter for policy. There's every reason to believe there's a role for private provision of electricity transmission as there is for generation. And I think it would be a valuable element of policy, really government policy, to encourage private construction and asset ownership. That sits somewhat separate to the planning of it. So it needn't be an impediment either way. Although I think probably the 220 kV being a relatively more standardized technology is likely to make it more open to more service providers to build privately than the larger ones.
But you've already got AusNet services for a project company, extremely experienced and know the ins and outs of this whole game. They proposed doing a privately funded extension of the network to in Gippsland, and they were saying they could achieve that by 2027. This is that one that we include. If they did it privately funded, there's no way in the world that the mums and dads and businesses would have to pay for the cost. It would be isolated to their private venture. If the cost blows out, if the project's delayed, it's for them to resolve that with their customers, the renewable generators, or the offshore wind developers they connect to. In Queensland, I led the development of non-regulated shared developments of the grid. Queensland has got more than $1 billion with non-regulated connections. The LNG gas industry, all sorts of things. It can be done, and it is much more effective and speedy. And I know that's a different model to what Victoria is used to, but I can see parts of Plan B that can be done that way. Doing the 220, I don't think that's possible. I haven't put my mind to it because it's well and truly part of the shared network used by everyone.
I'm interested at the point around, I guess, land use and expense, like the reduced size of the easement required for Plan B. I think it's an interesting one. Although my understanding is that the kind of bulk of the land that we're going to need for the transition is for generation, not for transmission. And you kind of, at the beginning, talked about how you sort of focused on this 95% type of being on consumption rather than generation within Victoria. And I'm wondering, does that mean that Plan B would require quite a significant increase in the amount of renewable generation built in state in Victoria?
Okay, sure. Can I just summarize the question for the benefit of the people online? The question was whether Plan B will mean more land to be set aside for wind and solar in Victoria relative to the extended VNI West. Briefly, yes, is the short answer. Extended VNI West, or the VNI West, entailed that Victoria would be importing 25% of its electricity by 2035. By definition, that's a whole lot of wind and solar production elsewhere. So there will need to be relatively more land set aside for wind and solar development inside Victoria. I should stress, I think that'll happen anyway, irrespective of VNI West. I simply cannot see any state government forging ahead with a policy in which they envisage actually relying on their neighbour through an interconnector line, which can go out at short notice for these risks that Simon has said. So I think in practice, they're likely to be very similar.
Add to that, it's a trivial amount of land. We will be generating 1/10 of the amount of renewables and using 1/15 of the amount of land to do it that Germany does per square kilometre. It's 0.1%, less than 0.1% of agricultural land. But on top of it, my other thing is that I think that rooftop solar is the cheapest energy in the world. And if we force people to, well, not force, encourage people to have east-west solar and their own storage and their own demand response, like running a hot water in the middle of the day, or those grid demand will It has already fallen and it will continue to fall because that is the cheapest and most reliable way to do it, is generate it as near as possible to the load. So I know this is radical, but none of these transmission lines will ever recover their cost of capital.
I agree with you entirely about locating the generating source as close to the local. I've been planning 50 years, and that is the first primary rule. Yes, you can locate it on the roofs of houses.
Do you want to just talk in the microphone?
You can locate it on the roofs of houses, but the distribution network that you have is not sufficient for handling huge amounts of rooftop solar. AEMA's forecasts of the amount of rooftop solar much higher than what we have assumed, but they ended up with the generating capacity equivalent to that of the Latrobe Valley on people's roofs, feeding back into a distribution network which could not possibly handle that. I think your distributors are already finding a lot of problems with their distribution network, high voltages, safety issues with the rooftop solar you've already had. The forecast in AEMA has Victoria having higher growth in rooftop solar than Queensland, South Australia. Why? When the sunshine is much better up there. And Queensland has had severe problems now with their distribution networks being overloaded by the rooftop solar they've already got. So yes, rooftop solar, closer to the load centre, great idea, but you've got to spend a lot of money on your distribution network. You still need energy storage there, so it goes hand in hand with battery storage. I'm not a great fan of battery storages in a house where my children are sleeping because of the fire risk. But yes, your points are valid about closer to the load centre, but you need to spend a lot of money on the distribution network.
Just very briefly to summarise for the online audience, the issue was the extent to which large-scale production will be substituted by distributed supply. A range of views on it. I think, Peter, the long and the short is we'll need a great deal of large-scale production as well. And we've got a large-scale transmission system which is failing very badly now. It is stifling investment that we need anyway. We need to get on with the transmission job. We can't hold off and wait to see the extent to which it's going to be distributed. We need to get on with a realistic transmission job as soon as we can anyway. Sophie.
Completely on top of the question. Coming back to your first recommendation, like where are you at in those discussions with getting the jurisdiction over this planning? And speaking about time, how much time have we got on our sleeves to spend in this kind of negotiation? Time to get government, the energy operator to really consider this.
I don't think we've got time at all. We're in the crazy situation that existing large-scale wind and solar producers are sitting idle for far too many hours of the year. That's a drastic waste of money. So there are things that can happen right now to augment the transmission capability that sit outside of this big debate, which is why we say we encourage VicGrid to look as a matter of urgency at those and VicGrid, make a decision. As to the Victorian government's proposals to establish VicGrid, I understand legislation is passing through the Parliament to establish it as a statutory entity. It's for the government to address their intended timing for that. We would urge that as soon as possible, changes are afoot. It's ridiculous that we're in this situation. It wasn't discovered overnight. It's been brewing for quite some years. And it's extraordinarily frustrating that after all of the V&I West debate, we're sitting here saying, here's an alternative. Our systems of regulatory development are not working adequately, that we are in this very place now.
Just on timing, I'm sure that 220 kV network stretching from Redcliffs down to Mirrabel needs to be done for both plants. It can be done quite quickly. You're talking about quite standard transmission equipment. You're not talking about the very long lead times that we have with 500 kV transformers and circuit breakers, etc. There are quite a few contractors with experience in Australia with that sort of work. I would think, and you're on existing easements. So I would think if we put a mind to it, you could get that left-hand side rebuilt within 3 years, and you're going to need it, the bulk of it, even if you do proceed with the extended DNI plan. And I would recommend Vic Group seriously look at kicking that off, plus all of those 3 measures I said about getting more out of the existing grid. Cost very little. Have a go, have a crack, see whether they do work, because they will help with the existing situation. So, and that can be done much more quickly than slogging it out with the community on 500 kV lines, which is just bound to fail.
Listen, thank you very much for this work. Might I ask you to address perhaps a little more forcibly the thinking that informs the recommendations. And it would actually seem to be useful if we could see them again, because I think some critical things that have been from. Firstly, do I infer correctly that your recommendations are informed by a view that AEMO, as it certainly was operating at the time of the Western Renewables League ACCA report, was operating in conflict of interest of being both project component, market operator, as well as systems planner? Do any of the recommendations address that issue?
Okay.
And it seems to me from all of what's been observed today, there is a link, is there not, in all of this that brings you to this critique of the DNI West proposals. And it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it remains the fact that the economics of DNI West depend upon the economics of Western Renewables route link. That from your first slide, you noted that the VNI West idea first emerged in the 2018 Systems Planning Report, which might be said, if there was a conflict of interest, had the effect of hijacking the route north rather than south of Ballarat, Western Renewables. So the question about conflict of interest seems to be in the significance of recommendations, in particular the review that's inferred about the necessity of there being independent economic analysis of the premises underlying these projects. Also gives your eyes, does it not do it also? 2 other fundamental public policy questions. One is the reliance on cost-benefit analysis of particular species, the process of government decision making. And secondly, the question of the utility of the red sea as a species of cost-benefit analysis. 2 things. The economics of Western Renewables did depend upon market benefits being claimed from the early construction of the DNI. That's good. So that to the extent that the Western Renewables League is the linchpin, the anchor of the economics of DNI West, do we not also need to go back to the Western Renewables?
Yeah. Let me first of all talk about the broader governance issues. Just very briefly for people online, the question is around the institutional roles of EMO and a conflict of interest and the role of the regulatory investment test in the assessment of parts of the VNI West. So as with just about everything to do with this project, there's layers and layers of reasoning and rationale. On the recommendations, the big picture is Victoria is alone amongst states of Australia to have the energy market operator, the entity that operates the market and operates the power system, also planning it. It didn't used to be like that. It used to be Vencor, a state government body. It was transferred to EMO when EMO was made in the context in which these major transmission expansion decisions weren't being made. I believe that EMO's enormous role across the market operation, power system operation, keeping the system going, the buying spare reserves, planning the transmission system across the states or having a major role in it is a conflict of interest. And so for that reason in part, but largely because we believe the plan they've come up with is not tenable. We believe that VicGrid ought to actually take it on. On the cost-benefit analysis question, I was riding on the weekend and our broker spoke in my bicycle as it happened, and I couldn't then ride home. And of course, waiting for, for my wife to fetch me, I've got to think about the cost-benefit analysis of my broken spoke. And at the moment it was broken, I would have valued that benefit as the value of, the enjoyment of my bike rides, which is more than the cost of the bike. Otherwise I wouldn't have bought the bike. And so if I was doing that sum at that moment, and I couldn't actually replace the wheel, it was a whole bicycle, my cost-benefit analysis cost is price of spoke, next to nothing, against benefit, the value of the bike. It's absurd, but that's what cost-benefit analysis is. It's completely contestable, arguable every which way. And in the case of VNI West, two legs, make the one contingent on the other, shift the costs and the benefits to the other, you can get whatever answer you want, which is why when I went through my history, look at how the rationale for this transmission line has changed so drastically over the last 3 or 4 iterations that the tests have been run over a span of 3 years. What's changed in our power system over that period? Nothing. We know we need to actually decarbonize. We know wind and solar is the new fuel source. So how could you plausibly get to such a different rationale? And that goes to the regulatory institutions, the cost-benefit analysis, EMO's role in part. I think other states with their jurisdictional planners, they're heading where VicGrid has said they're going to go, which is minimize the cost. Be done with all the obscure cost-benefit analysis because you can do what you want with it. So they're not suffering from the same problems that we are. They are not in the position that we are all here right now, having an incredibly tendentious debate in face of a severe policy failure.
I've had a good look at the original Western Renewable Link regulatory test and justification as to why it was lowest cost, and it's flawed. It does not follow the regulatory test rules. Basically, that 500 kV line from Sydenham to Ballarat, the 500 kV substation, what it says is it's needed for WRL. Yeah, we'll include the cost of it, but we've got to assume we're going to interconnect. So it's going to have to build the same line. It's going to build the same substation. So it can carry that cost from as soon as that line is required. So WRL only paid for that line and that substation for about the first 7 years on the assumption that somehow it was going to defer its own expenditure on a view that VNI would occur. The regulatory test says no. If you have to incur expenditure for a project, it's for that project to justify. You can't use this assumption that a future project is going to somehow make the expenditure and investment go away. It's there and it must be justified. And if you remove that, it took 228 million net present value out of the benefit of what they call option C2 for WRL. It would have failed the regulatory test. The 220 kV option B3 would have been streets ahead. I documented this. I've submitted it to the Australian Energy Regulator, along with many other clear proof that the regulatory test has been rorted and there's severe non-compliances. I've been totally ignored in putting that to the Australian Energy Regulator. I don't understand why they can't see these things for themselves. They don't appear to be properly policing the electricity law for us, for the consumers. But there was no doubt that WRL was not economic when it was approved. It couldn't justify the cost of that 500 kV works, not just the substation at Ballarat, but the line itself.
Peter.
Bruce, as you know, I have no particular technical expertise on the matters you're talking about, but I do. It seems obvious to me that we have problems, that we have Victorian government, they don't commit to one part. Simon, you and Simon, your colleagues, shown at least suggested there may be problems in that. and that there is an alternative line. That's what we've been doing. My concern is how we find a way through this. This has enormous implications for our energy future. It also carries heavy issues for the Victorian government and for that matter for our England. How can we work our way through it? You reckon you suggest big grid delivery. But I was particularly interested in what Simon said, and I just wanted to see if I understood that. Are there things that could be done in the reasonably short term while the decision process is about the West going on, which will support both approaches? That is, it will take Plan B ahead, but it won't compromise B and I West. So we could actually be moving towards a better outcome while there are reviews. Because we need to get people looking at things that are not in the big dispute, but which can move things on.
Yes, so can I just briefly summarise for the people online? The question is what can be done now while the debate takes place? And so Simon is now going to talk about the elements of the Plan B, which I'm seeking on the screen as I'm sliding through it, as to what can be done while we debate what ought to happen. I can't find the slide, Simon. Do you want to just talk while I look for it?
Basically, almost every one of the projects numbering 1.1 through to 1.8. I think you're going to have to open circuit the barometer directive lines to make project energy going to work. I think electrically, it's not going to work. So I'm open circuit switch anyway. I think you're going to have to do that. I think that if you could get some more power over your existing 220 kV wires, get some more power over the existing 220 kV network, that has to be a good thing. I believe technically that, and AusNet would have to do this, they own those wires, but I believe that the following steps, 1.2 and 1.3, very low cost, but they will get more out of those existing networks. So that's, and for either plan, that's got to be a good thing. 1.4, Elan to Mirrabul, spare easement, it's only 43 kilometres of line. There's a huge number of inquiries for new renewables out there to the east of Ballarat. I expect those same stations are, existing stations are spilling a lot. I think that, you know, we're only talking about 150 million, something like that. I would suggest getting a move on with that. It's going to be needed in both plans. Gippsland, well, that's a big cost. As I said, that was proposed by AusNet Services to be doing it completely unregulated at their cost. Well, let them do it. Let them work it through. I know they've got their challenges with the communities down in Gippsland. The market will determine whether that's a viable alternative. But the regulated customer doesn't have to fund that. And it's going to be needed. If the offshore wind gets up, it's going to be needed by some of the renewables already establishing themselves in Gippsland. But if AusNet want to do it, let them go ahead.
Yeah,
and then the other ones, it's much the same thing. You've got to reinforce the 220 grid.
I just want to stress the point that in terms of resolving this going ahead, if the government can be pushed to do some things that are actionable, that is involved in both.
So
that is a possible way.
Yeah, I think Simon's pointed to the things that can be done. The difficulty is the institutional arrangement to execute, and that means getting VicGrid as the entity as soon as possible so that they can push the button.
Virtually all of those projects require AusNet services. It's their easements, it's their network. So they are an important player in this, and there just seems to be a rift between AusNet services and AEMO. which might be getting in the way of this. Ben.
Thanks very much for this. If I summarise AEMO's response to this, which they put an extra statement out this morning on, it's essentially they reject the modelling findings. They say that Plan B will not deliver sufficient the increased renewables hosting that you would say it will. That 10-metre easement widening of existing easements is over-optimistic, and they expect that some of those easements will have to take wider than that. And they dispute the cost modelling of BNI West, something about and then reiterate their support for BNI West as the proposal to engage in their consultation over 5 years. So it appears that there's not much ground for they unlike some of the people who often comments they view which is read it overnight and gone into some detail.
I can respond to all those.
Can I just say something very briefly? I think this is perhaps all the more reason that there's an independent view on this. I fear that this didn't happen overnight. Institutions have adopted positions and they are now wedded to them. It's too hard to change. That calls for independent assessment. Simon, detail.
Just on the, so one point they've got is it won't provide the hosting capacity. They need to understand that we provided way more hosting capacity than what Victoria needs for 95% renewables. And one of the reasons we've done that is to reduce the spills at the existing renewables, reduce the losses on that 220 kV or 500 kV network. So we don't necessarily want to use all the hosting capacity. You don't need all the hosting capacity. Some of it is to reduce the wastage of renewables, because the thicker the conductors you put up, the less wastage there's going to be in transmission losses, and you'll stop that spilling. So don't need all the hosting capacity. We only need 80% of it. Second one about the easement widening. Well, the 10 metres is, we need about 10 metres between the base of the existing tower and the base of the new tower. So they might be just saying, oh, well, there's a little bit more than that. It might be 15 metres. 15 metres, I can tell you, is ample. Whether it's 15 or 10, who's splitting hairs? That is not a deal breaker issue at all. It is not going to require people's homes to be knocked down, as they said in their draft media release or the media release last night. That is just emotive and untrue. Your other point, what was the third point again? Costing.
Yeah.
Okay. I attended an inquiry into Humeling last week in the Victorian inquiry. The chief executive of Transgrid had just reported that the cost of Humeling is now expected to be $5 billion. Right? 2 years ago, it was 3.3. It's gone up 50%. $5 billion. Humeling is 330 kilometres of 500 kV line. WRL and BNI West in Victoria is 420 kilometres of line. 420 compared to 330. Surely it's going to cost more than $5 billion. It has to. Our estimate was about $5 billion, 4.5 billion. I think we're on the low side, based on what Transgrid are saying. So this is just reflecting the fact that high voltage, especially 500 kV equipment and the sort of kit that they're buying is getting more and more expensive. Contractors are charging more and more. Like Transgrid's already awarded the contract for building this stuff. They know what it costs. So I believe the CEO of Transgrid that they're looking at $5 billion now for Humeling, but that means BNI West in Victoria is probably going to cost 6 to 7, not the 2.5, I think, that AEMO received.
David.
Is there any way we can insist on fixed price contract based on those costs?
Yeah, they've tried that. That's the way Snowy 2 was managed, fixed price contract. Transgrid tried to do that with Project Energy Connect. But these things are outside the control of the contractor. You know, the effect of COVID came along, and that's had a huge impact on the availability of skilled workers and the working time they do and the additional costs. Worldwide, the cost of this equipment has gone through the roof. Interest rates have gone up. The contractor's got to wear that cost. So there's a lot of costs there. I think it is totally unreasonable to expect the contractors to wear. If you do, what happened to the Snowy Clough Engineering? Went bankrupt because of fixed price contracts. It's not reasonable. It can't. You can do it in theory, but it won't work.
Surely Transgrid would just say, no, we're not going to do it. And wouldn't that just stop it?
Transgrid won't do it.
But, well, they won't do it at a fixed price.
Just to clarify here, David, you're kind of assuming that Transgrid want the costs, or each of the network service providers want to get the costs as low as possible. If they're confident the regulatory regime allows them, on the basis of a cost benefit analysis, the broken spoke, to pass through more, they have weak incentives on costs.
The Transgrids of the world do not build the transmission lines. They engage contractors. Increasingly, they're bringing in contractors from Spain, South America, Italy. That's who's building Project Energy Connect in New South Wales. That's who's building 50% of Hume. Those contractors have never built projects in Australia before. They don't understand the arrangements with the unions. They don't have the skilled workers, and they can't get them. And I'm hearing that the contractor for the New South Wales part of Energy Connect, they're running 2 years late already. They've hardly started. They're on their knees. It's not practical to do this. So you've got to go to the root. You need the resources, you need the skills, and you've got to pay for it. You can't just assume that they're going to wear it through some contract.
Can I ask for any final questions before we wrap up? Two.
I'm wondering if what your plan is now that you've got this report, and I guess what interest or who's speaking in the Victorian government and what kind of their appetite is for
Right. I have not had any direct interactions with them. They're aware of it. I understand that the minister is very concerned about the issues we raise, and they're being seriously considered. I think things have reached a difficult position. It's clear there's a great deal of substantive evidence to suggest that there are serious concerns. So I'm afraid I don't know. We haven't had detailed communication with the government on it. We hope that they are open.
They will consider the report, but more or less back in May, rigorous assessment.
Yeah, so and that's been the path hitherto. So we hope for a change, but it is what it is. One last question from the back.
Yeah, just saying to your second recommendation, I know that you said that the Treasurer and Energy Minister should provide guidelines to the Committee Commission. Do you have any reference on what those guidelines might look like? Do you draw those up, or perhaps I'm missing something that's self-evident?
No, you're not missing something that's self-evident. It's a very good question. It links in, I think, to the independent review. At the moment, actionable ISP, to use the technical term, which is AEMO's done its plans, it's ticked its homework and said they are good, and it then becomes actionable and it gets the force of law. That regime is not, we believe, giving suitable outcomes. So it would be essentially that the Productivity Commission says, here is a mechanism by which the Clean Energy Finance Corporation can assess whether funds are being dispersed in the public interest. And I think it's a big, hard thing for them to do. They have the economic reasoning and rationale. I think the independent review would hopefully work with them to say, here is a set of criteria that ought to be followed. It's extremely relevant because the CEFC now has the money to spend. So it needs to be dealt with as part of it. We felt we couldn't wait on ministers to come up with a new agreement, that this should happen in between. So, that's our thinking. Any final question? Peter.
The whole transmission issue is very difficult, and the RIP text is designed to be watered. If you assume a slightly lower view, transmission.
Yeah.
And transmission volumes of the high volume are actually falling. So if they go on, they use all these projections to show we need much more transmission. And they get paid for 40 years.
Yes.
At these high returns.
Yeah.
It's just amazing how much effort they can return on effort they can get by convincing the regulators that we need this return.
Yeah. So Peter, I'm not sure if we've changed your mind, but it's lovely to hear you singing from the same song sheet. And I know that I haven't. I know that we've been of a similar view. Can I close it at this point? Thank you all for what has been a fantastically good debate. And prior to closing off, I want to make special mention of Darren Edwards and Simon. Darren wrote an exceptionally good paper on social license. He understands social license as the world actually is, and we are delighted and so pleased to have had Darren's guidance in writing this report. His insight and judgment have been very valuable to us. I'd also like to thank Simon extremely deeply. Simon has worked tirelessly, week after week, emails at all hours of the morning, month after month, almost year after year, on this for no expense. No one paid Simon. He has imparted extraordinary knowledge to us in the public interest. And so I'd like to thank them both for joining with us in this work. You hear that we have a great deal of passion on it, and we hope something positive comes of it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent, Darren. Well done.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Bruce. Hey, Lewis. How are you? Nice to see you.
Yeah, I was actually saying to someone the other day, I wasn't